Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Security Studies. Today we're going to be talking about something that is often forgotten, which is the statelessness condition of a lot of people in the Southern African region. And to do that today, we've got Emmanuel Biozo, who's a senior research consultant for the Institute for Security Studies, who has just written a report on statelessness in Southern Africa and reflects a lot in terms of the policies of individual countries and how they're dealing with the issue of statelessness. She will also define for us what statelessness is. And then we will also hear from Lloyd Kuveya, a research consultant for Amnesty International here in South Africa, and then Sindisiwe Moyo, an advocacy officer from the Scalabrini Center of Cape Town. And after our initial presentations from Emmanuel, Lloyd, and Cindy, we will then also hear from Liesel Muller from Lawyers for Human Rights, who works specifically on the Statelessness Project as an attorney in that project. And without wasting too much of time in terms of introduction, I think it bears stating right from the outset that for a lot of us, those of us who do have statehood, it is often something that we neglect nor forget how fundamental it is to have citizenship, to have a nationality that you can choose to identify with, not least because it allows us to have access to basic services, to have access to the healthcare system, to be able to buy houses, cars, or basic goods, relying on that existence of identity. It follows then that when you do not have a statehood or you are rendered a stateless person, that your access to things that may seem basic to everyone else becomes much harder. And so this morning in our reflections, we will look at the state of people that do not have statehood, but then we will also look at the ways through which governments are either doing well by individuals of that sort, or actually where their policies are acting or impacting negatively in the livelihoods of people that are stateless. And so first, turning to you, Emmanuel, in terms of just your reflections, the research that you've done in this year that looks specifically at statelessness, which is an issue, let me say, that us as the Institute for Security Studies have not focused on in the way that we are now doing. So yes, we have covered individuals that require protection, including those that seek asylum and those that are granted refugee status. But statelessness is not an issue that we have covered to as great a detail. So Emmanuel, I'm asking or calling on you to introduce the theme and then also to reflect on what you did during the course of your research.
Sure, okay, thank you, Otilia. So statelessness, the definition of statelessness are people who have no official connection to a state. So that means that they're people who have no protections from a state and no responsibilities to the state. So it does work both ways. We work in the migration department, and we started to see, it's not a topic that typically comes up within migration, but we've started to see it come up at a global level, really, within the migration discussion, and that's primarily around cases related to foreign fighters, so foreign fighters who have gone to fight in terrorist wars and are trying to return to their home countries, and the home countries are saying, there's a debate around their citizenship, so people are stripping citizenship from them based on those activities. And then also increasingly from countries who are sort of viewed as having restrictive migration policies. So statelessness has always been used as a method of exclusion. It's not a new issue at all, but you're starting to see it spoken of a little bit more within the migration realm because people are starting to using it increasingly as a way of excluding people that they consider undesirable, and that's extending to migrants, refugees, asylum seekers. And there's some cases of that within Southern Africa, specifically South Africa. Globally, the nature of statelessness is such that people are undocumented and therefore we can't and unaccounted for, so we don't know specifically how many there are. Estimates are almost useless, but estimates are the UNHCR estimates that there's roughly about 12 million stateless people in the world, and that 1/3 of them are children. One of the key issues driving it is that only 70 states across the world actually report statelessness statistics, so that's part of why it's impossible. They don't track it, we don't report on it, so it's part of what makes it difficult. This key statelessness conventions are the 1954 and 1961 statelessness conventions from the UN, and they came after World War II as a result of starting to see statelessness as one of the impacts of that war. They have not had the same participation as the 1951 Refugee Convention. The causes of statelessness are really, really broad. I'll go through some of them now, and I'll look at them probably more from a global perspective than a specific one. It can range from something as simple as like an administrative omission, so people who should be documented and wanted to be documented and just aren't, all the way to mass exclusion of millions of people as a form of discrimination. So the key factors that really drive it are discrimination, so ethnic and racial discrimination. 75% of the people who are stateless in the world are of minority populations, and that's how it's been most widely used. Gender discrimination is a major one. So 25 countries to this day still have laws that prevent women from conferring citizenship, whether it's to children or to spouses, at the same basis as men. That issue has developed, that one, post-World War II, almost all countries had gender discrimination within their nationality laws, and that's an area where there has been lots of progress. But 25 countries do still have gender discrimination on the books, and 8 of them are in Africa. Administrative barriers is a massive one. So in a lot of cases, even where there are legal protections, legal rights to nationality for people who are excluded, administrative barriers are either preventing them from accessing that nationality willfully or accidentally. So in the SADC countries, 50% of kids under the age of 5, or at the age of 5, are still undocumented. And that can be, again, just omission. It reflects many of the barriers to get documents, and then sometimes it's intentionally frustrating people from getting them. Gaps in nationality laws. So this is a big one. So countries, generally speaking, have either confer nationality based on being born in the territory or based on having blood in the territory. If you move, and usually when you trickle it all the way down to the bottom of the laws, there's some combination of the two. But if you move between a country that confers it based on soil to a country that confers nationality based on blood, you can end up in a situation where you don't have rights to any nationality, and that's something that's quite common. Again, civil registration. So a lot of statelessness conversations talk about civil registration, specifically birth, because birth is the moment that's most important in terms of getting any documents, and specifically you can't get a citizenship without that birth registration. And again, 50% of kids within the region aren't getting proper birth registration by age 5. So birth registration is a huge focus. Statelessness is in this instance, statelessness falls within a larger issue, again, of how many people just aren't getting access to it. So most stateless people in the world are actually living in the countries that they're born in. In Southern Africa specifically, one of the key moments, if you will, that's generated statelessness is state secession. So a lot of the issues that have come up in the region have come up post-independence, when states changed or who was in charge has changed. And that's historically a key moment that generates a lot of stateless populations. Consular services, and it is another aspect that sort of comes in from the side that often gets ignored. But consuls have a major role to play in preventing and eliminating statelessness. But what often ends up happening is countries that have large flows of immigration, they typically don't have the resources available to have really robust consular services and provide that in the countries that people are going. So there's a big gap there. And a lot of that time that's the reasons that drive people to leave a country is that country's under-resourced. So the likelihood of them having great consular services in a host country is less. That goes down. At the core of a lot of statelessness, or at the core of states' reluctance to really battle this, is really the topic of state sovereignty. So this is something that's come up increasingly within migration dialogues, is that states are very jealously protective of their rights to decide who gets to come in, who gets to stay, who we get to call nationals within this country. And in a lot of situations, states who have signed on to conventions or have signed up to specific rules, they don't follow them, and the defense is the state sovereignty. And we see that a lot in migration dialogues. It came up relentlessly in the Global Compact for Migration last year, that it had to include language specific to states and their sovereign right to determine who gets to come in, who gets to stay. And that's what's driving a lot of the political behavior around statelessness. I think, I'll outline a little bit of the situations within Southern Africa before handing it over to my colleagues to speak a bit more specifically, or letting the chair hand it over to them. But in the region, we have at least sort of 3 major statelessness situations that require quite a bit of attention, and that's Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Madagascar. Most of the situations within the region are linked to colonial histories, so borders that changed, colonial histories, border changes, migration is a big one, and gender, ethnic, and religious discrimination, as well as really poor registration systems. These are all contributing to it. So colonial borders, often, as everybody probably already is aware of, really interrupted. They were drawn almost arbitrarily through communities that already existed. The biggest statelessness populations, or in Zimbabwe in particular, are among communities that were sort of divided by these borders. And then the post-colonial transition has been a major factor in people who moved into countries during those times, and then post-colonial transitions, large populations that have remained after that time. That's where we're seeing some of the biggest situations today. I think I'll cut off there and hand it over.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. You've already started a bit on Zimbabwe, and I'm looking at you, Lloyd, because the work that you're doing now with Amnesty International covers Zimbabwe specifically, but also the issues around then the ways in which people have been rendered stateless, or those that simply just never got their citizenship or nationality ascribed to them years ago and still remain within that condition. If you can maybe share with us a little bit more on the specific case of Zimbabwe, and maybe dig a little bit into what do we do? Over to you, Lloyd.
Thank you very much, Ottilia, and thanks, Emmanuel, for your exposition on the broader aspects of statelessness. Now, the Zimbabwean situation is somewhat a bit controversial, coming from the position of the UNHCR and what the Zimbabwean government has stated on the issue of statelessness. So how it all started in terms of the discourse itself is that in 2016, Zimbabwe was going through its universal periodic review at the UN, and the UNHCR submitted its statement on statelessness. And they mentioned that about 300,000 people are stateless in Zimbabwe. Of course, that was an estimate. It was not a figure that came out as a result of any research on the ground. And so the Zimbabwean government denied that there were 300,000 people who are stateless in Zimbabwe. They made commitments, of course, to ratify the 1961 Convention on Statelessness to reduce and to prevent statelessness in Zimbabwe. But then later on reneged on that commitment. After that UPR process, there were further discussions, and the UNHCR then sort of said to the government, well, you are denying this existence, allow us to do research on the ground. And so the government said, no, look, well, you can't do that research on your own. You would have to do it jointly with us. Around 2018, the Ministry of Home Affairs released some shocking statistics that there are over 3 million people in Zimbabwe who are undocumented, who do not have any documentation. So in response to that, the government then said, okay, look, we will allow one of the commissions to go right around the country to do research on how many people actually do not have documentation. So in August of this year, the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission went around the country, and they are finalizing that process at the end of this month, just to ascertain how many people actually do not have documentation. The second agreement that they came up with also is for the UNHCR, in conjunction with the government, to carry out a research on the ground on how many people actually are stateless in Zimbabwe, and that process is starting early next year, around February, March. And so this is where we are. The government position is clearly that there is no one who is stateless. In actual fact, every person comes from somewhere. So there are people who came from Malawi, Mozambique, Zambia, who are settled in Zimbabwe, and therefore, I mean, that's where they come from. And the Zimbabwean government said, look, we will assist people with citizenship, with documentation, but we would need the countries of origin to also come through and assist in terms of giving their citizens documents. So for instance, we all know that Malawi, I think, Emenoa, you mentioned that there are poor registration systems. Malawi is a typical example where I think they only started this year to actually begin to formally register people in terms of giving them birth certificates and everything. And so before then, it was very difficult. So when they came prior to independence, migrated as a result of labor issues in search of employment on commercial farms and mines, a lot of them did not have any documents. So it became very difficult now when they then tried to claim Zimbabwean citizenship, even though a lot of them had stayed in Zimbabwe for a long time. They started families, gave birth to children. Now, when those children now wanted to get documentation, like a birth certificate or something like that, the Department of Home Affairs or the Registry Department would say, can we have your parents' ID or birth certificate? And they didn't have those documents. And so they were then asked, okay, look, then you have to go back to your country to get those documents. It was difficult because a lot of the stateless people stay on mines, on farms, and really their salaries are very low. So the issue of poverty and lack of capacity also comes in terms of their inability to process their citizenship claims. And so what also then happened that contributed to this inability of people of Malawian, Mozambican, and Zambian origin to obtain documentation is that in 2001, there was what I would call arbitrary deprivation of citizenship. I think Emeno made reference to that through an amendment to the 1984 Citizenship Act. And they said that, in fact, that was targeted at white commercial farmers, and it was meant to disenfranchise them from the voting process, because essentially there was the rise of a very strong opposition party in 1999-2000 in the form of the MDC. and they figured that these people will be voting for the MDC. So there was that arbitrary deprivation. The law simply said that any person who holds dual citizenship must renounce the citizenship of their country of origin within a period of 6 months. Now, those people who were, exposed to media and knew what was going on, took advantage of that. Essentially, maybe some of the white commercial farmers were able to do that. But it also then affected people of Malawian, Mozambican, and Zambian origin, most of whom were resident on farms and mines. A lot of them were not exposed to what was happening at the national level, and most of them did not take advantage of that situation. So, what did that mean? It means that they did not have Zimbabwean citizenship anymore because they did not renounce the citizenship of their country of origin within the required 6 months. So they were no longer citizens of Zimbabwe, but they were also no longer citizens of their countries of origin. So that's how they became stateless in Zimbabwe. But then now there was a lot of pressure from other SADC countries to say, but what have you done? In 2003, they then amended that Citizenship Act once again to say, look, okay, we will allow any person who has come from a SADC state to now claim citizenship and confirm Zimbabwean citizenship. But a lot of the people, again, were not able to do that because also there were cost implications and also the administrative hurdles that Emeno also made reference to still remained, where you need your parents' documents and everything, and some of them did not have that. So that situation still remains up to now. But what has the government done in terms of positives? Is that also in terms of just maybe trying to get the vote? So giving people IDs was also a way of getting people to be able to register to vote. So we give you an ID, you are then able to vote. So it was sort of like a give and take. So some of them do have now IDs, but those IDs are endorsed A, which means alien. So you have an ID, you are able to vote, but you are also still recognized as an alien. So a lot of the citizenship benefits do not accrue to you. So it's really not, you are still remaining a stateless individual because you don't have full citizenship of Zimbabwe. So that is yet now to be ameliorated. Hopefully, when this process ends of actually documenting how many people are stateless and the real impact of statelessness in Zimbabwe, perhaps the government will then give people proper IDs and citizenship certificates. And this thing can be done. We saw it in Kenya with Uhuru Kenyatta, who gave Shona-speaking people, about 4,000 of them, early this year, Kenyan citizenship. And so I think the government just needs to take a political decision to say, I think we just need to reduce or prevent further statelessness and give former migrants and their descendants certificates of citizenship so that they become full Zimbabwean citizens.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. You've expanded on some key points that Emeno presented on, where there's the administrative barriers, where there's the issues around lack of access to information that actually allows for people to register births firstly, which I think is perhaps the fundamental step first, and then thereafter actually be able to exercise whatever rights they may have. But one of the points which now, as I turn to Cindy, which I think really does need quite a lot in terms of reflection, is this gap between what people guess is the number of, in this case, stateless individuals or those that are undocumented versus what could be the actual figure. Now, we know that we've got challenges in terms of data collection generally, and this is even where the systems are available to do that data collection. And I know, and as I turn to you, Cindy, in terms of some of your reflections from the work that you're doing at the Scalabrini Center in Cape Town, at what the situation here in South Africa is, and importantly then, if you have at all any information on accuracy in terms of figures, in terms of data, not just in terms of statelessness, because I think when we wrap up this segment, we also just need to reflect a bit on the extent to which migration within Southern Africa has influenced state building, but also responses from the states as well, and where statelessness then falls into almost this crack where it can be used as a tool, or where it just becomes an easy, we don't know how many people actually are in a country. So Cindy, your reflections.
Okay, thank you everyone. I work for an organization in Cape Town that provides services to refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, and South African citizens. And we work on the ground, so I think I'm going to talk more on the administrative as well as legislative issues that we believe or we've identified as issues that have actually left some people at risk of statelessness in South Africa. So I will reflect on those administrative and legal barriers that has put people at risk of statelessness. And some of the things I think Amy and Lloyd have actually mentioned. I'm going to start with the issue of birth registration in South Africa, because as people working on the ground, as people who see clients on a daily basis, this is something that has come out as a huge issue. And also looking at the amendments that are coming up within the government in terms of the birth registration legislations. Last year they amended though it's still in the progress, but there is an amendment of the regulations to the Birth and Death Registration Act in South Africa. What does that mean to especially to foreign children who are born in South Africa? So basically, I'm just going to try to make it as simple as possible so that people can understand, because we also just work on the ground and see these realities, what the people are facing. So when it comes to birth registration, the main challenge is that the legislation in South Africa, especially when it comes to foreign children born to foreign nationals, they are required for birth registration to occur. Foreign parents they need to have valid legal status for them to actually enter Home Affairs offices and register the birth of the child. A passport on its own without a valid visa will not suffice. So you need to have a valid visa for you to be able to register the birth of your child. For asylum seekers and refugees, they need to have valid permits at all times for them to be able to register the birth of their children. And then again, we look at the challenges that are facing the asylum system in South Africa, and that has left a lot of people kind of in an undocumented situation, because from 2012 a lot has happened when it comes to the refugee system in South Africa. Some of the refugee offices were actually closed down, like Cape Town office in 2012 they actually stopped taking new asylum applications. At the same time they stopped renewing asylum permits and refugee permits that were issued in other refugee offices in South Africa. For example, if you applied for asylum in Pretoria or in Messina or in Durban and you were residing in Cape Town, you were expected at all times to go back to Messina or Pretoria or Durban to renew your permit that side. And asylum permits are only valid at most 6 months, sometimes 3 months, sometimes 1 month. So if your permit is valid for a month, it would mean within a month you have to return back to Messina, Durban or Pretoria to renew your permit. And that left a lot of people with expired permits. And at the same time, there were children who were born during that time, and the parents were not able to renew those permits, and they were therefore not able to renew to register the birth of their children. So birth registration has been quite a big issue. And also, as we know in South Africa, children born to foreign nationals, they do not automatically acquire South African citizenship. A child who is born to a foreign national is also a foreign national in South Africa. So they normally are given a handwritten birth certificate which is not entered into the system. So it doesn't have an ID number, it's handwritten, And the challenge that we see again now is that those birth certificates, if they are lost, I mean, we see a lot of things happening, xenophobia, where people's houses are burnt down, or people's things are stolen, and so forth. So that birth certificate, if you get it, if you lose it, and you don't have a copy, it cannot be reissued. So meaning that if it's lost or something happens to it, then that's the end of it. And then also, looking at the asylum system, I spoke about the closure of the refugee office. Cape Town refugee office is still closed. Of course, there was a court case. The case went up to the Constitutional Court, where Home Affairs was ordered to reopen that office by 31 March 2018. That office is still closed, meaning that a lot of people are still not able to access the asylum system, because they cannot go and apply for asylum in other offices. If you are in Cape Town, you are expected to go and apply in Messina or in Pretoria or in Durban or in PE, because those are the only 4 offices that are fully operational when it comes to taking new asylum claims. And then again, the challenge is that those offices are also, I mean, they are full, they give appointments. Currently, what we understand with the PE office, Port Elizabeth, is that if you go and try to apply for asylum there, people are already getting appointments for as far as 2021. And then again, when it comes to the other challenge with birth registration in South Africa is that people are required to, this is in terms of the law as well, people are required to register the birth of their children within 30 days. But because of the challenges that I just mentioned now, failure to renew permits on time, the geographical issues surrounding the refugee offices, people not being able to go and apply for asylum as soon as possible, then they fall into that system where now birth registration becomes what is called late birth registration, because once you miss the 30 days deadline, it becomes a late birth registration, where again it becomes a very onerous process. You are required to bring certain documents, you are required to go through certain interviews, and also when it comes to foreign nationals, they need to verify their documents, because remember, birth registration is done by the Civic Home Affairs, and we talk about refugees and asylum system who fall under a different system. So when they go to register the birth of their children, they need to verify those documents first with the refugee office, and we see that process can take even more than 2 years. And sometimes people are on asylum system because the process also is very low. There's a lot of challenges within the asylum system. So you find that some people end up giving up. Maybe they stop renewing their permits, or they receive final rejections on their asylum claims, and they're expected to go back to their countries. And once they don't have valid documents, again, going into the Home Affairs office is an issue, and then the children remain undocumented. And then the other issue that we've identified is the issue relating to what is called unaccompanied and separated, especially foreign children. When we talk about unaccompanied and separated children, okay, let me start with the definition, just the short definition of unaccompanied children. Children who have come to South Africa on their own without biological parents or anyone who by law or custom is supposed to care for that child. So basically the child is alone, there's no one caring for that child. And then we define separated children as children who've come to South Africa without their biological parents, but they are with someone who actually cares for them, like a brother, a sister, an aunt, or so forth. Again, documentation for those children in South Africa is very challenging. And we find that most of those children, they come to South Africa without any kind of documentation on them. In 2015, Scalabrini conducted a research entitled Foreign Children in Care in the Western Cape. So what we did, we went to all the CYCCs, the Child and Youth Care Centers in the Western Cape. We did a survey of foreign children who are placed in those centers, just to have an idea of how many foreign children are in care and do they have documents. And some of the findings was that for that survey, we found that there were 109 children, and these were the children who were surveyed, A large number of those children had no birth certificates or document which would enable them to claim, to have a claim to any particular nationality. That was 80% of the 109 that were surveyed. Based on factors such as irregular migration, lack of birth certificate, passport or any other relevant documentation, and lost contact with family, it was estimated that 15% of those children were at risk of statelessness. And then in 2017, we did another survey, again on unaccompanied and separated foreign children who were kind of in informal care, who were being cared by other people besides the youth care centers. Again, we found about 109. Of course, I mean, the survey does not reflect all the children who were in informal care, because we relied only on cases that came through our doors. And from the survey, we found that 55% of the surveyed children lacked a birth certificate, and 21% of those children were considered to be at risk of statelessness. And then looking at the South African Citizenship Act, which was amended in 2010, it makes provision for foreign children born in South Africa to be granted South African citizenship upon attaining majority age, that is when they turn 18, if they can prove that they were born in South Africa, they have that birth certificate, they have lived all their 18 years in South Africa, then when they turn 18, then they can approach Home Affairs and apply to be recognized as South African citizen. But there are two difficulties with this provision. This is what we found out. Section 4.3 speaks to those children whose birth was registered. Remember, one of the requirements is that birth registration should have happened. You should have a birth certificate that was issued here in South Africa, that handwritten birth certificate. But looking at the challenges that I just spoke about, a lot of those children, they were born in South Africa, but they don't have the birth certificates because of the challenges when it comes to documents relating to their parents. Their parents are not documented, they are not able to get the birth certificates. Therefore, those children will not be able to claim South African citizenship when they turn 18. Children whose birth certificates have been lost or destroyed, again, they will be in that same situation because they will not be able to prove without the birth certificate, because the birth registration is a prerequisite. The other difficulty was that the Department of Home Affairs has also indicated that this legislation or option is only applicable to children who were born after January 2013, because the law came into place in 2013. The amendment came into force in 2013. But the provision, the interpretation of this provision is the subject of litigation. The matter is still in the courts. But what we know is that it was successfully argued in the Supreme Court of Appeal that the section cannot be interpreted as only applying to children born after 2013. So the court said it should apply to all children, even those who were born before 2013. But Home Affairs is appealing that judgment now. There's also another section in the Citizenship Act, section 2.2, which also speak to individuals who are born in South Africa but are not recognized as citizens or nationals of any other country. Again, we're talking about stateless people. However, a birth certificate is a prerequisite. But when you look at most people who are at risk of statelessness, they don't have a birth certificate. So if that is going to be a prerequisite, then it's not going to work for any stateless. It's not going to help any stateless persons. So those are some of the administrative and the legal barriers that we've seen in South Africa that have actually placed quite a number of people at risk of statelessness, especially when we look at foreign nationals. And I'm just thinking also on the issue of Angolans who were refugees in South Africa. I think some of you might be aware that in 2012, Angola was declared as a safe country, and their refugee documents were cancelled, and they were expected to go back to Angola. And most of those people had been in South Africa for more than 20 years, and some of them had no homes to go back to. And when their statuses were cancelled, they were given options, either to go back in South Africa. There some of because of challenges with people being expected just to uproot and go back to Angola. At some point, due to talks between Home Affairs and organizations, Home Affairs decided to give them 2-year permits in South Africa, special permits, which have been extended now for 4 years until 2021. But some of those people, they missed out on those special permits because it meant them going back to their embassy to try and get passports. And for some of them, they couldn't even get passports because their embassies required birth certificates, IDs for them to be able to actually be issued with passports. And some of those people are now at risk of state because they don't have the birth certificate. They fled Angola in the early 90s and they don't have anything to prove that they are actually Angolans. Some of them have actually gone, I think, for interviews at the Angolan consulate, and they've been told, no, the way you speak or things like that, you are not an Angolan, and those people are now at risk of statelessness.
Thank you so much, Cindy. When Emmanuel in her presentation said that 50% of children under 5 years old in SADC, so not just in South Africa but in the region, do not have birth certificates, for me I thought that seems like such a high figure, except now as you've painted this picture particularly of the difficulties of the registration itself and doing the registration on time, first and foremost, but then also recognizing, which is something that Lloyd mentioned when he spoke, which is this issue around poverty and inequality. So when we speak about an individual having to resubmit their documents 2,000 kilometers away, for a person with means, it's not a difficult conversation to have. But when we recognize, using here in South Africa as an example, that the overwhelming majority of people live below living wage and then still below even a basic minimum wage that has only just been enacted, you're asking individuals to essentially take whatever little they have to be able to go for a process that may not, and this is now the difficult conversation, that may not result in getting a month or 6 months or a year. So then the gamble perhaps that people make is, for as long as I'm not identified, I'm comfortable, as it were. But at the end of the day, and you spoke about it, Cindy, you spoke about violence targeting foreign nationals that we've seen across the country at different points in time, where the issue that they are undocumented becomes an easy way to justify the targeting. And a lot of them don't have the documentation, so they can't use that to rebut the argument. And I think then we've identified a number of issues of concern. We've identified the data gap. We've identified the issue around the challenges administratively, geographically, in terms of registration of statehood, first and foremost. And then we've also identified the ways in which that statelessness can be instrumentalized across the board. And this relates now, we've spoken about Zimbabwe, we've spoken about South Africa. Before we look at maybe some key recommendations, Emmanuel, you mentioned that that Madagascar also is considered to be a country where the statelessness issue is quite prominent. If maybe very briefly, if you can maybe highlight that example, because I think it's one that isn't often spoken about, and perhaps similar to Zimbabwe, similar to South Africa, it's one that is rooted in history. Yeah. So it's not a recent statelessness circumstance, but it's actually one that dates back even further back, I would say, than both South Africa and Zimbabwe. So if you can maybe just introduce that as well. Yes.
Yeah. Sure. So Madagascar has a minority population that's predominantly Muslim of Indo-Pakistani descent. I think they're referred to as the Karana people, but I don't know enough about the situation, but apparently that's also a derogatory term, so I'm going to try and avoid using it. But at independence, the minority population was excluded from citizenship because they weren't considered Malagasy. And I'm not entirely clear on the politics behind it, but it's a situation that has persisted since 1960. They've been denied citizenship, and in cases where people have have had legal entitlement to it, they've been sort of willfully frustrated out of the process. So sent away for not having the right accent, or had steep fees required of them. So they still, 60 years later, are widely stateless, and they have to go and renew a residency permit routinely. And Madagascar has made progress. So currently there's a 10-year campaign being run by the UNHCR to try and eliminate statelessness, and they uphold Madagascar as one of the situations that's made some progress. So Madagascar has eliminated gender discrimination when it comes to conferring nationality to children, which is great, and that's celebrated, and they've also acceded to some of the statelessness conventions in the last 10 years. So this is progress that they're making, but none of that has translated into any citizenship for this minority population. And I'm not into, again, and it's also, my interpretation of what I've read is that most of it's an economically vibrant population, and so maybe it stems from some xenophobia in terms of jealousy. So there was one publication that said even though they make up sort of 5% of the population, they generate up to 1/3 of the national GDP. And so maybe it's direct xenophobia, because the population isn't enough to interfere politically, which is what you see in Zimbabwe. People have been politically excluded because they didn't want them to vote for the opposition. The population isn't big enough in Madagascar to impact the political outcomes, but I think it sort of seems to be just direct xenophobia. And there's been great progress, but not in that population, which is so now women are able to confer their nationality onto children born of non-Malagasy fathers, so that's great. But again, it doesn't translate to any effects on the biggest affected population.
I think the point, which is the Southern African region is a region of 16 countries, and each of these individual countries have their own challenges in respect of registration, and perhaps almost by way of taking a step back. And we've reflected on 3 specific country situations, and also included the aspect as it relates to people from Angola who've been in South Africa for over 2 decades, for example, but have no way now, or it's difficult for them to get their proper and correct registration. This is perhaps something that is not unique to the 3 countries, but is in fact illustrated by, and this conversation's helped to illustrate the extent of the issue in these individual countries, but then also to look at what could be the case, for example, now in countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that themselves are currently facing different forms of conflict, particularly in the eastern region, where you do have people who are now caught in a protracted conflict. What is the ability, for example, of people in regions in the in eastern Congo to be able to register their births? If, for example, in countries that are currently not in conflict, that challenge is already there. And I think it helps us also to just reflect on the extent of the issue, but to not limit it, and to say, even now as Zimbabwe embarks on this process with UNHCR, this is by no way the end of the process, but something that then needs to have some focus. Before we go into a discussion and a Q&A, Lizo, I sort of want to take advantage of the fact that you are here, and I know the work that Lawyers for Human Rights has been doing specifically on various categories of migrant populations, but for you, specifically on the issue around statelessness, if you can maybe reflect for us on what has been said, but also from your experience in the Statelessness Project, what are some of the things that maybe we've missed in the conversation so far? Thank you.
Thank you. Cindy, I was very impressed with what everybody said, and I agree with everything. But so what I want to only add is that what we miss sometimes when we talk about statelessness is that statelessness is only sort of the outcome of something else, which is active denial of citizenship, which people already have a right to. So that changes kind of the narrative, the way that we talk about statelessness. The way that government officials talk about statelessness is that people who migrated, people who made themselves stateless, people who have not followed the migration rules, and that's not actually the case. Amy told us that 50% of people who are stateless in most countries are people born in that country. So the issue and the way that I like to frame it is to talk about access to the right to a nationality, and that the people that we are talking about are people who already belong in the places where they live. These are people that have strong economic, social, cultural links to the places where they live, and they should be entitled to a nationality, and in many cases are already, in terms of the law, entitled to a nationality in that country, and it is merely a situation where the government is discriminating against particular people based on things such as race, religion, gender. So it's not a migration issue really, which is something that that the governments like to frame it as a migration issue, because then it makes it another country's problem. It makes it the migrant itself, the migrant herself, the problem. When meanwhile the problem is the discrimination which is found in the state itself. And so we need to talk about it as these people who have rights and valid links, and what the African Union calls appropriate links to states, but is being denied by the state. So it's a problem that can be solved by states. It's not a migration problem. Yes, it can be caused sometimes by migration, but the main cause, and I think this is the case in SADC, is what I wanted to say about SADC, is that it is caused mainly by lack of administrative justice. And so that is our position as Lawyers for Human Rights, that if we have a system in SADC where people are properly registered, when they apply for citizenship, they are given proper reasons and proper processes and proper documents. These are the things that will lead to access to nationality. And then just the last thing, the African Union has a wonderful initiative on nationality at the moment, and it's called the the protocol. At the moment it's a draft protocol to the African Charter on the specific aspects of the right to a nationality and the eradication of statelessness in Africa. And this protocol is a groundbreaking international law treaty which will change the way that nationality as law has worked in international law over decades. And it is very exciting, and if we adopt this very African approach to who we think belongs in which countries, we will solve statelessness in Africa. So as a region, we have to make sure that we adopt that protocol and implement it with a strategic, with a plan in the region. That's what I wanted to add. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. And you've brought into the conversation something beyond the state only, which is that whether it's at SADC level or whether it's at the African Union level, that there does have to be at least agreement and consensus in terms of the way forward, and at least we're seeing some light. And I mean, outside of the African continent, we've seen some examples of countries where, and Lloyd mentioned political will as being instrumental and fundamental in changing whether it's a current gap or an otherwise complicated situation. So where, for example, in Colombia, where they have allowed for the registration of births of children a little bit quicker, and also allowed for the registration of any births, regardless of the nationality, so much of the parents, and ensuring, because this is where we can speak about it today, but when we speak about in the long term, all the individuals that are not registered today add on to the extent to which people are undocumented. And the point that you make, which I think is important and something that we need to then reflect on, is that people don't register themselves so much. So you can only do so much in terms of your process to be registered, but the entity that actually does the registration is effectively the state, and therefore there is a responsibility also on the part of the state, where people do present themselves to, at the very least, find a way to deal with the situation as best as possible, bearing in mind the challenges administratively and so forth that come with that. So thank you very much, Liesl, and thank you, Emmanuel, Cindy Siwe, and Lloyd, for introducing the theme. We've only just sort of had this initial conversation, and we will have a discussion which we will hold under Chatham House rule, so it will be a closed discussion after we bid farewell to our online audience. But before I do that, it is important to thank specifically the Hans Seidel Foundation that made this research possible, and that has allowed for us to be able to do research that goes beyond traditional migration issues and concepts, but because they are related and because of the history around the ways in which people have been excluded from registration, I think it is a particularly important topic. And as the ISS, we always have to thank our partnership forum, who are the donors that make it possible for us to do the range of the work, and that do include the Hans Seidel Foundation and the European Union, as well as the governments of Australia, Canada, Finland, the USA, as well as Ireland, and the kingdoms of Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. And with that, thanking our panelists, but also Liesl, thanking you for adding to the panel from the floor. We'll then in a moment go to our discussion segment. The discussion segment is, I'll repeat, held under Chatham House rule. You are free in your interventions to either comment or ask a question if you do have a question, but don't feel compelled to pose a question. If you've got a contribution to the discussion, you can do so. What having the discussion under Chatham House rule means is anything that we say after we bid farewell to our online audience is something that you cannot directly quote unless you've got the consent of the person who said it. It is especially important for us to have quite an open conversation around these issues, because I do know that this is an issue that is not without controversy, and so I do ask for those of you who made your way here to the ISS for this discussion to respect that particular rule.